Welcome to our session on the question, are cities ready for international events? So before going through the panel that we have today, I would just take a few seconds and I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land in which we gather today and pay my respect to the elders past and present. I would like to also extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people here around this gathering today. I would like to thank the French Chamber in Australia of Commerce for the organization and the French Embassy Australia, and namely the sponsors to supporting this event. Joining us on this very interesting and insightful chat, I hope we've got Carole Collin. You are the Commercial Strategy Director of the Jeux Olympiques and Paralympiques for Paris 2024. Welcome.
Good morning, Christophe.
Good morning, good afternoon for us.
Good afternoon, sorry.
We also have Andrew Westacott, CEO of the Australian Grand Prix. How are you, Andrew?
Well, I'm on mute. Bonjour, Christophe. I'm very well. Good to see you.
And we've got all the way from Queensland, Zach Davis Hancock. You're the Managing Director of Pacific 13, or Pacific 13, the Rugby League.
Good to be with you.
First of all, thank you for joining us. I'd love to start this discussion on the road with Carole. The Olympics are scheduled for 2024, so it's far away. But of course, we know what the world is going through right now, and we'll dissect all this. How much learning you're putting through from what the world is going through right now in your thinking going ahead for Paris 2024?
Thank you, Christophe, for your question. So, as you know, Paris 2024 is in 4 years from now. So we are still in the planning phase, and we will go in the operational phase after Tokyo. So we should have done that this summer. It's been postponed for a year. So we are looking very closely at obviously at the sanitary crisis, but also at the economical crisis, which is impacting us as well. But that, I would say, it's part of of the game when you're planning such a big event many years ahead. We know that many things can happen, and we, especially for the Olympic Games, we are highly dependent on the geopolitical context, on the security, on the economic condition. So it requires a lot of scenario planning, contingency station, readiness station. So we're looking very closely at what Tokyo is doing in terms of planning, in terms of cost reduction as well, and we'll see what we can bring from their experience after the summer 2021 to include that in our plans for Paris 2024.
So on this, could you explain what your role is within the Paris 24? If you had to describe yourself for 1 minute or two to describe yourself.
Yes, so I'm part of the commercial team. So our role is to find private funds to fund the Olympic Games. So our budget is 3.8 billion euros, and 97% of it is coming from private funds. So it's 1/3 sponsorship, local sponsorship, 1/3 ticketing and hospitality, and then 1/3 coming from an IOC contribution. So our role is to find those private funds to make sure that we can finance the games. So I'm working on partnership, on ticketing, hospitality, and licensing.
Thank you, Carole. We'll come back to you in a sec. From one end of the scale to, no offense, the other end of the scale, Zachary, you are, the Olympics has been here for more than 100 years. You are trying to start, or you're starting an event around a very well-loved sport here in Australia, the Rugby League.
Yeah, so we're actually trying to get a new rugby league team into the Intra-Super Cup competition in Queensland that will be based out of Noumea into the competition for kickoff in 2023. Now, on our board, we've got people from Paris, we've got people from New Caledonia and from Vanuatu in here, but yet we are in the process of doing the youth development work with young potential players and things of that nature. But some of our coaching staff can't actually travel to do the coaching, so we are actually having to train train coaches to do the coaching digitally, to deliver coaching sessions on the ground in the Mea. So from that perspective, but also even from a commercial perspective, trying to meet government agencies over there, trying to meet potential partners over there. There's a lot of this talking on Zoom happening to keep us going.
So that's the international aspect, and I guess we will come back to this in our session today. And Andrew Westcott from the Australian Grand Prix. So if we talk about sports and motorsports, it's not been here forever, but it's been here for a long time. And the Australian Grand Prix itself, as a nation of lovers of motorsport, have been around for quite enough time to have a lot of experience going through this as well.
Yeah, it has, Christoph. I'm sitting with a backdrop here, which is Albert Park, and Albert Park hosted the Australian the Australian Grand Prix in 1953, and the first ever Australian Grand Prix was held down at Phillip Island in 1928, and that was actually Phillip Island is now the host of the MotoGP event, and we are the joint promoter of MotoGP in October, which sadly would have been this coming weekend here in Australia, but that has been cancelled in May, and Albert Park is the location now in the modern era. And Melbourne has hosted Formula One since 1996. And for lovers of the sport, and there are many in France, the first Australian Formula One event was held in Adelaide. And Adelaide had the contract from 1985 to 1995. And Melbourne, we say, stole it from Adelaide, or we acquired it from Adelaide. And it's been here. It would have been our 25th race this year, but we will have our 25th race next year when we will be ready to host international events again.
I hope so as well. And let's also remember, if you are a fan of Formula One, the last world champion from France, Alain Prost, won his title on the streets of Adelaide. That's a little bit of a sports nerd history for
me. Daniel Ricciardo is racing for Renault, so at least for this year, and he got the first podium since 2011. So there's a lovely link between the Aussies and French motorsport.
Absolutely. Andrew, going back to you, and I'd love to open this to the debate to everyone, but I think one question that is on the lips of everyone that is loving sport or not, but amongst this COVID period, are crowds essential to run an event like yours, actually, Andrew? You know, what's the go on crowds, on public?
Well, motorsport, MotoGP and Formula One is probably those sports that actually are much better suited than some sports to being television attractions. But, you know, crowds and live sport and live entertainment is really enhanced when you have crowds in the venue, whether it's cheering rugby league teams or at the end of the 100-metre sprint or any athletics or any event at the Olympics. Now, sports in Australia is all about crowds and crowd entertainment. There has been matches this year that have been done without spectators. We're working very, very closely. Melbourne's the only city that hosts a Grand Slam tennis tournament and a Formula One event, and both are being planned for crowds next year. So they're important from a ticketing point of view, but they're also very, very important from the way it contributes to Australian society.
Carol, can I grab you and bring you into this debate? Because, of course, the Olympics is one of the most viewed sports event in the world when it's on. It's very reliant on TV rights and all the sponsorship rights, but it's also very important to see heads and bodies in the crowd as well, I guess.
Yes, obviously. I mean, spectators are a big part of the Olympics experience. Just, to give you a few numbers. I mean, we are going to sell 14 million tickets for Paris 2024. So it's a lot of people, a lot of sessions we need to organize. And one major goal, at least it was until now, is to have full stadia, because that's really, what makes a difference when you have a full stadia for the athletes who's competing, but also for the people who are watching on TV and for the people who are attending the event. So obviously that's something very important. It's a bit different, at least it would be for Tokyo. But one key thing that the IOC president has mentioned is that Tokyo will happen, but it will happen with spectators. There won't be, Olympic Games without any spectators. So there will be on reduced numbers of spectators, but we want to keep, some fans to be there and to support the athletes, because it's so important and it's such a big part of the experience. Regarding Paris 2024, it's in 4 years from now, so we don't know yet how it's going to be in 4 years, but we hope that we will come back to a normal sanitary situation, that we can really have a full stadia in 4 years from now.
Let's hope so, because it'll be worrying if we're not. I'm telling you.
Agree.
Zach, that question for you is a bit different, but more or less the same. How do you build a team? When you build a team, you need to build a following, I guess. And to build a following, you need to display your strong and weaknesses on the ground and show what you're capable of. How do you build a team from scratch when you've got very little access to a crowd?
It's an interesting, because our competition that we aimed to come into was completely scratched this year. So they're hoping to bring it back for what they're saying anyway, that'll come back in 2021. For us, though, it's about fan engagement. A lot of that will happen digitally as we roll out our bid. So we'll be heading into the next stage of our fan engagement process throughout 2021. For us, it'll be doing that bit right now, so that hopefully by the time we get in 2020 for 23, we actually have fans built up, and we've got our season tickets sold and things of that nature, so that we're ready to go for hopefully full stadium in EMEA in 23.
Okay. Open question to the floor, actually, probably a bit more towards Andrew to start with, at least. Do you think the sport you are involved in has made leaps and bounds this year? Had to, because the sport was back to the wall. It was a question of surviving and existing. But we know Formula One and motorsport are on the edge of technology, on that forefront of technology. Where do you think your sport, or sports, I should say, with an S, have made those leaps and bounds?
Well, like a lot of sports, they rely on a multiple income stream. Carol Report said earlier on about sponsorship. Sponsorship is a major part of the revenues of Formula One and MotoGP, but media and broadcast rights are, and also promoter fees are. One of the things that Formula One and MotoGP had to do was survive this year, and what they did to achieve survival was basically go around and reconfigure the championships, which in Formula One's case would have been across 22 different countries across, apart from Africa, all continents. They had to reduce that 22 races down to 17 races, primarily in Europe, although they will go to Bahrain and Abu Dhabi towards the end of the year. And between them and MotoGP, they've survived by having 31 races across 14 different countries in a COVID environment, some of those with crowds. We're going to see crowds at Portugal in this coming weekend for Formula One, and there'll be crowds later on in probably Bahrain as well. Now, what they've done is they've done deals to survive. Some of those have been on new circuits. Some of them have been double headers. Some of them have been existing circuits with different arrangements. And I think it shows that not only do you have to have commercial flexibility, but the other thing they're doing is making sure that every one of the people who are going to the venues and participating, and there's probably between 1,600 and 2,000 at every race meet for Formula One or MotoGP, they've got to be testing negative, otherwise they don't get into the circuit. Valentino Rossi, positive result, not racing. Sergio Perez, positive result, not racing. So the rules have changed from Melbourne earlier on. The show must go on, and it is going on. So we've got to adapt, and I think professional sport is adapting appropriately.
But you talk about surviving this year, 2020. How do you survive 2021 if this doesn't solve itself? I mean, how long that survival mode can actually be a survival mode before it becomes a new model?
Well, I think there's an evolving model. I think we're all going to have to realise that there are going to be different facilities. Social distancing is going to mean, for a temporary venue like ours, indoor facilities are going to be very, very challenging financially. So we're going to have facilities that comply with the rules. And we have to, in Melbourne, particularly, because the reason we host MotoGP and Formula One and have a very, very mature major event strategy is to entice tourism to come to our city, to have economic benefit, and also to obviously brand Melbourne. Now, you can still brand Melbourne and you can get minimal economic impact, but you've got to have tourism, and we've got to open it up to probably the rest of Australia. And for a period of time, we won't have the international visitation. So there's an element of survival and getting through 2021 for us. And then beyond that, I'm sure we're going to learn new ways of working that are going to be making us more powerful in 2022.
Okay, so therefore, Carol, on that note, how do you make sure that the Tokyo Olympics are going ahead as we need them to go ahead for Paris to be successful as well? They are always, the previous Olympics are always a stepping board for the next one. So it's important, I guess, for you that Tokyo displays something great so that Paris can display something even greater, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, we are looking very closely at what Tokyo is doing in terms of preparation and planning and, different scenarios. And they're really working very hard to have the games ready for this summer. So it's a very, very difficult exercise they're doing. It's a lot of work which is put into that. So we will look at it very closely. We will learn from it. But obviously, the situation would be very different for us. It would be 3 years later. So we won't have COVID, I'm sure, in 3 years, but we might have something else. So we need to do other scenarios and planning. But what we are really impacted now, on top of the sanitary crisis, is the economic crisis. So what we've done in the last months with all of my colleagues is to look at two things. One is to look at our revenues, are they at stakes? Is there things we need to do differently? So far, we have secured 50% of our sponsorship revenues, which was a target that we had for the end of 2020. So I would say we're on track, and we're still confident that we will get all the sponsorship revenue by 2024. The other big part of the revenue is coming from ticketing, but it's too early to say, we're going to sell tickets starting from 2023. So we won't have the sanitary crisis by then. But then what we've looked as well is to review our cost, to make sure we adapt and to make sure we won't have, games that are too expensive. So we completely review all our sites, and we've done that to find 400 million of cost savings in our project to make sure that, we would be able to respect the budget that we had from the beginning.
So is it fair to say that you placed the Paris 24 on the tail end of the COVID crisis? It's after the sanitary crisis. There's a potential economical crisis that could impact certain economies around the world, and you're preparing yourself to evolve in that environment.
Exactly. I mean, we're already, in the middle of this economic crisis. We can feel it. It's when you go and talk to potential partners, there are many things they need to solve, big companies today and smaller companies. But we still have very good feedback from those companies, and they still think that, partnership with Paris 2024 is very attractive. So all the talks we started with potential partners during the lockdown or before the lockdown that we had last year in France or last spring, we've continued those talks. Very few companies have said they were not interested. Even companies that are very highly impacted by the crisis still want, to continue those discussions with us. So that's a very positive sign. But what we see is that, it might take longer time to sign partnership that we would have done otherwise. And then we also need, to be realistic and find some flexibility in our budget. So that's why we've completely reviewed all our budget, all our costs, to make sure that we have this flexibility if the crisis continues in more than just, 2020 or 2021.
Christophe, I think it's an important point when you talked about the economics before. The major events industry in many cities, and Melbourne as an example, and the major events industry associated with the Olympics, I see is actually going to be an economic driver for, rebuilding the economy. I mean, we're a sports-led city. We're known in Australia as the sporting capital of Australia and one of the sporting capitals of the world. And by getting back to innovative solutions, our whole events industry and the infrastructure associated with it is actually a way of driving economic rebuilding. So it's an important component along with obviously other parts of the economy, and we should never forget that.
So yes, but if I argue the point with you, that was the case then when Melbourne built its image of a sporting city. But if we just reshuffle the cards right now, what are the risks of another city, let's say, let's not name it, but let's say Sydney, for example, coming to the party and reapplying exactly what Melbourne did successfully to also reinvent themselves. So therefore, you become to have a challenge with other cities replicating that model. That becomes a challenge for you.
Yes, it's a massive challenge, both in Australia and also in the Asian region. And when Melbourne and Victoria created the Melbourne Major Events Company in the early 90s and then the Victorian Major Events Company, that model of putting cities on the map was copied by Singapore and Hong Kong and Qatar and Abu Dhabi and Bahrain and so on. And so if you do not have these events, others will come along, and if we're not able to create them because of the health crisis, then you'll lose your position, and you'll lose your position either within your country or to other countries in the region. So it's a very competitive landscape, always has been.
And always will be, for sure. Zach, I want to drag this discussion towards more Queensland. Queensland in Melbourne has been the whole talk of the town because of the grand final being held in Queensland for the first time ever. For people that don't know footy that much, it's a first. But in terms of how much experience do you drag from this, for you, anything's possible. Anything is possible in terms of the event, and getting the Queenslander to fall in love with AFL means that anything's possible for you as well.
Correct. Look, in terms of the AFL Grand Final coming here, so we're in the middle of an election campaign here. So our state goes to an election literally the Saturday week. And what happens in that context is that the decision to bring the AFL Grand Final here originally caught quite a bit of backlash in certain sections of the media. But ultimately, that is in today's Courier Mail as well, that it'll be a boon for Queensland's tourism sector. And this is a state that is so overwhelmingly tourism exposed. Because not only here in Queensland do we have a major events fund trying to lure major events up here, but we also have regional local governments trying to lure major events into their regions as well. So we don't just have an interstate competition. For events, we've got competition between parts of Queensland that are so heavily tourist exposed. So the AFL Grand Final really does draw a lot from us, that if we actually go after these things, and we also in the events industry actually show politicians that it actually can be safely done, that these things will keep coming. I mean, the Melbourne Storm have been based here for most of the NRL season. Now, aside from an incident at a game where the crowds weren't properly socially distanced at Sunshine Coast Stadium, having those games on the Sunshine Coast has been a boon for the Sunshine Coast Council, because they've got an asset being that stadium. Now, they're bidding for money from the state government to get their stadium expanded on the back of what they've got from the NRL. And they'll continue getting NRL games for years to come. They've got deals to have two Sydney teams playing games there in 21 and the same in 2022.
So for you, it's the perfect storm in Queensland.
Correct. Like, we're going to have more events here. We're going to have, and it also starting to show, particularly in our regions. I mean, we've got regions like Cairns and the Whitsundays and the Sunshine Coast that 1 in 3 jobs in some of those places are tourism linked, that it is possible to actually lure these events here and to hold them safely.
And actually, that's a very good point, which I'll open to the whole floor and probably direct the question to Andrew on this. How do you convince the authorities your event is safe?
Well, it's what we're going, Christoph. We're going through right now. The first process for the organisers of the Boxing Day cricket and also the Australian Open, along with us, is to ensure there are processes at a state level and a federal level to get the athletes, the participants, the officials, and in case of Formula One teams, into Australia safely from a quarantine point of view. And then the second aspect is about configuration of the venues and the facilities. And then the third part is the operational sets of processes. We're a temporary venue. For those who don't know Albert Park, it's like Hyde Park. It might be like one of the major central parks. the Tuileries or something like that in Paris. And we're putting a Formula One circuit around it. It's a street circuit. So we can start with a blank canvas, and it's vitally important that we now work with those health authorities to design that. And that's exactly what we're doing now, and we'll keep doing that as our restrictions change. But the approach we're adopting is one that's modular, it's quite flexible. Every individual facility will be COVID safe, and depending on the social distancing, we'll be able to increase ratios or increase occupancy as we go through. Our event isn't for 5 months, so we're going to learn a lot in Melbourne about the tennis and the activities at the MCG.
But how do you convince the public the event is safe?
Well, you don't convince them, because the public will make their own decisions. But what you have to do is you have to have something that is going to pass the pub test. It's going to be sensible. It's going to be safe. It's going to be something that people feel comfortable going to in an environment that we have been locked up in lockdown for some 7 months. So we've got to actually exhibit safety, caution, and common sense in what we'll all say is the new COVID normal.
Carol, for you, in terms of thinking ahead, so far away, we can say your timing has not been disrupted, not like Andrew's or not like Zach, but it has been, in a way, probably the flow, the money was becoming, and the different steps that you've been going through. But how do you make sure you learn from what's happening now, but also keep learning for other events, not as just the Olympics?
Yeah, I mean, we're watching very closely, what's happening now. We have a lot of contact with different sports organizations, and we're learning from what they're doing. So I think, and that's going to be, a 3 or 4 years journey between now and 2024. So I think, it's part of, those big, international events that we need to do a lot of, planning and contingency session and readiness session. We need to be agile and to adapt. So we know we're going to have to do that. So we're looking now very much, at the economic crisis. We're looking a lot at the ecological crisis as well. And that's why, we've built our game to be on really a new model for the games. And that means 3 things. It's to have games that are more responsible economically. So we have, a budget that is much lower than what the other previous edition of the games were, and mostly because we're not, constructing new sites and infrastructure, but using the existing one. We also have a new model of the game which is more sustainable. So we will reduce our carbon emission by 50% versus the previous edition of the games, but we will also compensate those carbon emissions. So we will be the first game that are carbon neutral. And we also are building this new model of the games, which is much more inclusive. So we really want to have, the whole society, the city of Paris, the region, Ile-de-France around Paris that benefit from those games. So that means in terms of, economically, where all the markets that the games will bring, and it's more than 5 billion euros of markets, those are very transparent. We publish all the markets that are opening for the games so that everyone can, answer. Could be, big French companies, but also smaller local companies. We will create more than 150,000 jobs around the games, especially around tourism, sport, logistics, event organization. So we make sure that, everyone can benefit from the game. So that's, a new model of the game. So we are learning that. That was included from the beginning when we bid for Paris 2024, 6 or 7 years ago. And that is really, we will also have the IOC that really help us in this journey so that, the next edition of the game will also be built this way.
But in a way, does that change as well in terms of the sponsorship, for example? Technically, does that change where the dollars or the euros are coming from?
Well, what it changed really is the way that, people or companies look at us. I mean, we are not, the games is very special in terms of partnering with companies. We're not really doing sponsorship because as you know, the sponsors are not visible on the field of play during the games, which is quite unique. But we see that companies are coming to us for 3 things. The first thing is for business. I mean, when we make a deal with companies, like we just announced a huge deal with Orange, a big French telecom company, and they will supply all the, telecom infrastructure for the games. So for them, it's a big market. It's also a way to show their innovation and their expertise. So that's really the first thing, companies are coming to us because we have some markets. And in those difficult times of economic crisis, it's also important for them to be able to secure those markets. The other thing why people are coming to us is also to accelerate their corporate social responsibility strategy. I mean, we have very strong ambition in terms of sustainability, in terms of inclusion, and they see Paris 2024 as a way to be able to do, to achieve the objectives in terms of sustainability and in terms of inclusion in a much faster way. What they could have done in maybe 5 or 10 years, they will be able to do it in 2 or 3 years with Paris 2024. So we really, pushing our partners and working with our partners to find, new solution that will help them, accelerate those innovations that they want to put on the market. So those are very important. And I would say the crisis has kind of reinforced those two elements. So it's an opportunity for us as well, because we really are able to answer the needs of companies today and, fit with the strategic topics.
And Zach, in a way, you've been trying to build this brand around the Pacific 13. But how do you do this in a world where everything is online? How do you build that legacy? How do you build that little je ne sais quoi in French that would make your team different from any other team in the league?
So for us, we're in an interesting position because so there's a team in the competition already from Papua New Guinea. So the competition already has an experience with a international side coming into the competition. So we're not the first ones in that particular space. But the interesting part for us is we're essentially trying to build a sport from the ground up. So for us, it's about making sure that we get our partnerships in place in the right way, which are coming along. And that allows us to not only finance our elite team, but also to finance our reach out programs and to fund our youth development programs, so that over time we have players coming through our system sort of through the out years of 23, 24, and 25 and so on, so that we can create heroes for these places, and particularly some of the smaller islands in the outskirts of some of these places, so that we become a legitimate elite part of that sporting landscape. And it's about, from a financial perspective, actually, what this whole thing for us has done is to take a very different strategy to what some of the other clubs in the competition have got. And we've got a very broad-based corporate strategy. So we're not relying on 1 or 2 or 3 sort of big sponsors chipping in money, because then they're not there. Like we're a new team trying to come in. We have to be realistic about where our sponsorship base will come from. So we have a very broad-based strategy in that regard, so that we have the long-term sustainability from a financial perspective.
So what would be success for you in 2021? How would you judge in number of shirts sold, in number of bums on seats? I mean, what is a success for you?
Success for us is actually really easy for us to define. And that is that we can get to the end of 2021 and we have all of our partnerships in place that allow us to put together our final bid document to go to the Queensland Rugby League either in Christmas of 21 or in early 22.
Okay, interesting.
So
that would be a success for you.
That's success for us. So for us, if we're in a position to put together our final bid document and formally present it by the end of 2021 with meeting all of the criteria that the QRL has set out for us, then we're good.
Yeah. Andrew, I'd like to come back to you. We talked a lot and hear a lot about the new world post-COVID, post all this trauma that the world is going through. And one word that comes back a lot is sustainability. So Formula One and motorsport doesn't necessarily carry an image of a sustainable sport, but this is changing as well with new technologies. Can you tell us a bit more about how your event is embracing this as well?
It is, you're spot on, Christophe, because for many years it hasn't needed to be. They were massive V8 engines and for those who don't know the intricacies of Formula One, in 2017 it was sold and purchased by an American company called Liberty Media. One of the things they are now doing is really focusing on their sustainability approach from a sport and also diversity and inclusion. Prior to their involvement, however, the engines themselves, in conjunction between the FIA, the governing body, a French body, the governing body of motorsport in the world, and Formula One, they made a change to that normally aspirated V8 engine, a 2.4 litre, and went down to a 1.6 litre hybrid power unit that essentially uses 30% less fuel. It's the most efficient internal combustion engine in the world. And the great thing about Formula One, regardless of what criticism people will apply to Formula One and MotoGP from a sustainability point of view, is that the technologies from a safety perspective and an engine perspective and emissions perspective and so on really do drive technological change. But at a broader level, Formula One is meeting it head on. Now, the proof is going to be in the pudding, and I don't think they're as well progressed as, say, a big organisation that the IOC. But by 2030, Formula One has set the ambitious target to be net zero carbon emission, and that includes also the freight globally, the transportation to and from the venue, because the cars themselves are the least of the carbon footprint. Us, from a local event, we're going to be making a pathway and a commitment along with all other promoters to make big inroads into those targets by 2025. In other areas, we make sure that all our food goes to charitable collection agencies, that in a park we've got water recycling. All the water we use is storm water, not potable water. And we've got other initiatives locally to make sure that we're reducing single-use plastic at an event level. It's a long journey, but we have started it, and Formula One as a sport is facing it head on.
Yeah, absolutely. And then one of the points that we can talk about as well is how the teams responded to the COVID crisis using their technology to build respirators and technologies all around the world, helping hospitals all around the world through, we can say it, Formula One is one of the epitaph of technology.
It is. The technology is found locally in every English double-decker bus, but during the COVID crisis, as you said, many of the teams devoted their vast resources to respirators. Even in Australia, the medical centre from the Albert Park circuit went to one of our leading hospitals, the Alfred Hospital, to be used as part of their triage facilities. And every bit of leftover food from our corporate hospitality program, when we were cancelled on the Friday of the event, went to charitable collection agencies. So, Formula One has a strong social commitment, and under Liberty Media, that social commitment is growing. And it's early days, but there's a commitment that they're wanting to meet, and that's now diversifying into a diversity and inclusion policy, which is all about ending racism. And there's a banner called "We Race as One," if anyone's interested.
Yeah, absolutely. Carol, I want to move on the discussion around the legacy. And of course, Paris 2024, it comes out 100 years after the Paris 1924, which were the last time the French Olympics, of the Summer Olympics, were actually held in France. How much do you carry this across, knowing that you are building something that will be remembered as a one-off in many, many years to come?
Yeah, I mean, legacy is a very important part of our project, and obviously everything we do, we're thinking of what is going to be left afterwards. Obviously, we would have those 2 weeks for the Olympics and Paralympic Games of sports and celebration, but we need, also to leave something afterwards. So all our, project is built upon one vision, which is that sport change life, and we have this strong conviction that sport is a great tool for social inclusion, for education, for economical integration. So we have included that in all what we do, and we also want to leave a legacy in the city as well, because Paris 2024 will be a unique promotion platform for the city. We will have more than 14 million people coming to the city to attend the game. Most spectators will be coming from abroad, and we want to make sure that we leave a legacy. So, for example, we're working with the city to accelerate some of their development projects to make sure that what we're building for the games will help the local authorities afterwards. So we have only 3 infrastructure that are created for the games, but they will be transformed afterwards to answer the needs of the local population. So, for example, the athlete village has been thought from the beginning for its future use, which is housing and flat. So we will transform it after the game for housing and flat, but especially for student flats that are highly needed in the area where the village will be built. Same thing, we are building an aquatic center that will be in Sunny, but this will be transformed afterwards into 9 pools for the local population. So everything we're doing today is being thought for what will happen afterwards. And that's why we work hand in hand with the local authorities, the city of Paris, the region in the Paris area, to make sure that, we fit into the agenda and not the other one, that they have to fit into our agenda, because we will disappear after 2024, but they will still be there, and we need to leave a positive legacy to those games.
So do you build a time capsule for Paris 21-24?
Sorry?
Do you leave a time capsule for the Paris 21-24 games in 100 years from now?
Yeah, kind of. I mean, but we're really thinking, further or after 2024, to make sure that we have a legacy in everything we do. It could be for new site, as I said, but it's also, all the things we're doing around sport to make sure that, the games are here to inspire people to do more sports. So we just launched, for example, a strong engagement program called Le Club 2024, where people can be a member of the club, and then we give them a lot of challenges to do sports and try to inspire them to do sports on a daily basis. So that will also be part of our legacy. If people can do more sports, so they will be more healthy, there will be more inclusion, and we have 4 years to build that.
And Zach, when you build something from scratch, like you're trying to do, or you're doing at a minute, have you got this in mind, thinking about the legacy, maybe in 20, 30, 40 years time, build something sustainable for the future?
Yeah, and it's vital for us at its inception that it is sustainable over the long term, or it won't get off the ground. So for us, it's about ensuring that when we build our infrastructure at the base, that we reach out into not just Noumea, Tahiti, and Port Vila. We're actually reaching out into the smaller parts of our catchment zone. For us, it's about reaching into not just big cities, but also some of the smaller areas and some of the smaller islands. And we cover, we've got 860 odd thousand people in our catchment zone, but it's spread over the best part of 100 islands. So for us, it's about making sure that we're providing the opportunities for people who may not otherwise have that opportunity to engage in a sport and to engage in some sort of physical fitness and to better themselves by coming through our program. Whether they become elite athletes or not, whether they ever play in Trust Super Cup or not, they're in a better position than what they'd otherwise be.
And do you see, because you are at the forefront of it, but there must be a cultural difference as well. 100 islands, it means you've got Polynesian, Melanesian, you've got the whole Pacific around you, plus islands like Australia as well. Let's remind us an island as well. Do you see a difference?
Oh, of course, right? Like you have a Melanesian population, you have a Polynesian population, you've got a settler population, you've got an Australian South Sea Islander population here in Queensland that are descendants from the blackbirding in central north and far north Queensland. There is a cultural difference between all of it, but for us, it's about enabling these places to come on a journey with us, so that when I'm not here and the rest of our board aren't here, there are new people on the board and so on and so forth. We've built something that has a long-term capacity to it. We don't want to be. There have been flash in the pan teams in this competition before. Papua New Guinea have been in it and out of it. Right, there's been other teams that have come in and come out. We want to be a long-term fixture in this landscape for decades to come.
Okay, I think we're reaching towards the end of this very interesting discussion. If we can maybe have a final word from the three of you, and I'll start with Andrew. I mean, the question was, are cities ready for international events? Are they?
They need to be, and it doesn't. They won't be ready unless they face up to the realities of change and compliance. Because unless you control the transmission of this virus, then you won't survive. And so you've got to have a safe environment, and we've got to adapt to be able to then build economic strength and tourism and visitation. And so Melbourne is getting ready to host international events, starting with the cricket in December, and then the Australian Open tennis in January, and then Formula One in March, and then for us, many other things will transpire until MotoGP in October. So we will be ready, but it needs a whole end-to-end system approach, and you've got to be able to make sure that the fans, the customers who are going to come to the event are going to feel safe. Otherwise, they will not buy tickets, and they'll watch it from home. So it's more challenging rather than less, but I do think we're going to get there in 5 months' time.
And Carol, I mean, I'll direct the question to you as well, but I'll add a little bit on top. Do you have to go with a plan B just in case? Or is the fact that having a plan B is already accepting plan A won't work? Carol?
Well, I mean, I fully agree with Andrew. I mean, I think cities will need to be ready for those international sports events. But I think it's a challenging time, but it's a great opportunities for those sports events and those cities to rethink together how they can work together, and how they can really create opportunities for those cities through those international events to attract more people in the city, to create economical growth as well. So I think it's a fantastic time to rethink that and work together on a common goal rather than working on different sides. So yes, I think it's a great opportunity, and we need to work together. I think this is what we're doing. For Paris 2024, that won't be COVID that will impact us most. There would be other things, the ecological crisis, the economic crisis, and maybe other things coming up in the next 3 years. But that's part of it, and we will work with the local authorities to make sure that those games are a success and that we leave a strong legacy.
And then Zach, any plan B if plan A doesn't work? Do you have to have one?
Plan A for us went out the door before we launched. We actually had our launch put back because COVID was declared a pandemic. So we're already on plan B. Answer the question: yes, cities are ready for these things, but events have to take politicians with them, so that politicians feel safe that the events are safe, so that there is no blowback back on politician support for these things. In a previous life, I used to work in politics as a staffer, so I've got a bit of perspective on that. And if we can take officials with us, we will be able to take the public with us, and we'll be able to then start our economic recovery. And we'll be able to start the tourism recovery that places like Queensland so desperately need.
Great, good words. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Carol Collin from the Olympics in Paris 24.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zach Davis Hancock from Pacific 13.
Thank you.
And thank you, Andrew Westacott, CEO of the Australian Grand Prix. Thank you for joining us.
Merci beaucoup.
And you can, of course, join us for a Q&A session straight after this discussion. So we hope to see you there.